Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Welcome to a new video. I'm really excited to talk about all the books that I read in June. Time is going by so fast this year. We're already halfway through the year. I read 10 books in June, which in a sense feels almost unreal because I read 3 on my Kindle, and I think that's why it doesn't compute that I read 10, because technically I read the same amount of books that I read in April, which so far has been my best month of the year, but this one tops it because I read longer books. So I read more pages this month than I did in April, and yet it doesn't feel like it. And I think it's partly because 3 of them were on the Kindle and partly because 3 of them were romance books, and I tend to read them so fast that it doesn't feel like I read them, although I did. Anyway, I'm not going to spend too much time. Let's get right into it. Starting off with 3 books that I read in a reading vlog, which if you're curious, this is it. I invite you to watch it if you want to see my thoughts throughout. But the first book that I read in it was Heart the Lover by Lily King, and this is the sequel slash prequel to Writers and Lovers, which I'd read in May and loved. This one follows our narrator partly in college and partly after. In college, she has this love triangle situation with 2 boys, Yash and Sam, and then we follow her years in the future when one of these boys makes an appearance in her life, and she kind of reckons with her relationship with that boy from the past and what it means to her in the present. I ended up really enjoying this one, and I really enjoy the way that Lily King writes because she tells you the story straight up. She doesn't really spend time exploring how the characters feel or doesn't extend situations that don't really need to be extended. She just kind of tells you what's going on and then you can infer, which I think personally worked for me very, very well with Writers and Lovers, and a little less with this one because I wanted this one to be gut-wrenching and heart-wrenching, and it didn't end up doing that for me, and I think it's partly because of the writing and partly because I liked Writers and Lovers more. But I do think this one is worth a read, and I completely understand the people who ended up liking this one more than Writers and Lovers. This one reminded me of a movie that I loved, and I thought that the movie explored this kind of dilemma better than the book. But I also think it's because the point that takes you by surprise when you read this book, if you read Writers and Lovers, didn't take me by surprise because I knew what was going on from the beginning. So the end, which is brilliant, hit for me, but I think it would have hit more if I didn't make the connection between this book and Writers and Lovers. I don't know, honestly. I just don't understand how people didn't make the connection, so I don't know. I don't know. But I ended up really liking it, and I would highly recommend. I think it's a really good book, and I'm considering reading some of her other books, so if you have recommendations from her backlist, I would be interested. Next book that I read in that video was What Am I, a Deer by Polly Barton. Here we follow a translator of Japanese who ends up moving from the UK to Germany to work for a gaming company in which she is going to be translating the Japanese into English. And it follows her infatuation with this man who works in her office but who she sees and meets in a tram. And this leads her to have a lot of reflections over her own life and her own approaches to love. It's written in a stream of consciousness style, which at first was really hard for me to follow. The more I read it, the easier it got. But as I said in my vlog, what I ended up liking most from this book was actually the ruminations on loving and connecting with people that she had when she was thinking about the man that she was obsessed with. I think those were the strongest parts of the book, and I also think I feel that way because I don't love office settings. For some reason they feel so claustrophobic when I read about an office setting, and a lot of the moments that we follow from this character's life take place in the office. And I also think the third critique that I have for this book is that you are kind of told that this book is written years in the future, but you never make it to that future, and so it doesn't feel like she's really reflecting on those moments. It feels more like she's living through those moments, and I think having those time jumps at random points made the actual ruminations less powerful than they could have been. I ended up really liking the first part of this book, and then it kind of lost me, but I will say I adored this writing, and I ended up annotating this book even though I probably wouldn't have, considering that it's not a favorite for me, but because I really love the way she wrote and the things that she was saying, I would really consider revisiting my annotations. Not the whole book, but my annotations. And so for that, I am very curious to see what Polly Barton comes out with next, and that was What Am I, a Deer? And then in that video, I read my favorite book of the month, which was Into the Blue by Emma Brody. Into the Blue follows our main character, AJ, and the first part of the book takes place while she's in high school. She has recently broken her arm, and so she is stuck in her town, and she thinks that that's going to affect her ability to get into college because she doesn't get to go to a sports camp that she was supposed to go and that she was hoping would get her a scholarship. And she works at this video store where she meets Noah, the main male character, who comes from a family of very, very prominent actors, and they start working together as improvs. And AJ is doing this in the hopes of getting a scholarship and of leaving this town because she really, really wants to leave. They kind of bond over Noah's uncle and aunt's TV show. That was an improv TV show, and that is very nerdy. It's like the sci-fi TV show. And so a lot of the book explores this fandom space in a very heartwarming way, and I love the way that they connected. And then Noah disappears out of nowhere. Years in the future, they are forced to reconnect as they are going to be working on a sequel of that show together. And so they're going to have to improv together. I love the way that this book was written. I cried so much at the end, and I was torturing myself with the ending. I really believed in the story, and like I said in my video, it was this weird instance where I could see the flaws of the book, which I think most of the flaws come from the fact that the book is so long, and yet it doesn't explore some instances as well as it could have for it being that long, and it kind of starts repeating itself in the conflicts, but I still loved it, and that did not take away my attachment to the characters or the book itself. I also really, really appreciated the fact that this book ended in a different way than most romance books. I think especially with romance nowadays, where it's become such a large genre and a lot of books are being published, it's really hard to do something that's different, and I really commend Emma Brody for doing so, because I think what she did was really strong, but also it was different. And I really liked all the parts that she explored, and because they connect on such a strong level of acting, when they connect again in the future after Noah's disappeared, they still have this improv connection between the both of them, and they kind of speak to each other through their improv, and I thought that was beautiful. I can only recommend this book, especially if you like romance books, especially if you like the second chance narrative. I think that will work very well. Personally, it's my favorite because I find it a lot easier to believe a connection between characters when we're told that they've had this connection for so long, especially when we get to see them connect. And I also love the what if. It's something that works really well with my brain, especially with romance, and so I really, really love that one. So that was Into the Blue by Emma Brody. Then I also read Derived From Us by Grace Burns. This is a poetry collection. It's very, very short, and I decided to read this because I really enjoy Grace Burns. I just like her, and I've been wanting to read a bit more poetry because it's something that's really hard for me to understand. I will say I understood the main point of each poem in this collection, but I don't think that poetry is really for me, because I think poetry is this kind of thing where it's so therapeutic to write, and for me it's really harder to read because I want to know exactly what the author or poet was trying to say through their poems, and obviously you can't really do that because the point of good poetry is that it's not cliche or very straightforward. And so I don't know that poetry is necessarily for me, but I'm really happy that I read this. I think this is one of the coolest covers that I have on my shelf, and I would recommend it nonetheless, especially if you like poetry, because I do think some of the poems are very good. But like I said, because I'm not a big poetry fan, it wasn't the easiest thing to read, but I still really enjoyed it. So that was Derived From Us by Grace Burns. After that, I read La Révolte de la Reine by Morgane Moncomble. This is another romance book by a French author. In this one, it's kind of a reimagination of the French Revolution under the point of view of the monarchy. So it's kind of inspired by Marie Antoinette and the King of France, except in this book we follow Acacia, who is set to become the Queen of France and she is set to marry the king, Alexandre, even though she doesn't want to. So it's an arranged marriage trope, a marriage of convenience. They hate each other from the beginning, but they are both very attracted to one another. And yeah, that's their kind of romance book. There's a lot of plot twists in this book because at the same time, there are obviously people trying to overthrow the monarchy, and there's so much stuff going on. There's so much stuff that is revealed. This was my first book by this author in a while. I really love her romance books, and as I said in my last video, some of them are going to be translated by September, so that's really exciting. But I ended up really liking this one, but I do think that the romance was not my favorite, and it was not entirely believable to me because they just had such an intense lust for one another. And I'm someone who really likes romance books when the main attraction between the characters is emotional rather than physical. But I also think that maybe it's due from the dual point of view narrative, because when you're reading dual point of view, it's harder to make the plot twists believable, because to make them believable, you can't allude to them in either point of view. And so the revelations that we get of the characters, I was like, okay, but there's no clues that we are given that this is going to happen, or the clues were just so out of pocket. I was just like, you can't even imagine that that's going to be the case. And so when you get that plot twist, it works a bit less for me, and I thought that those were a bit too convenient. And that's why I really like single point of view romance books. I also think that they make the romance longer because you have to infer. And I think that's what I love most about reading romance, is when you don't know exactly what the character across feels, but you can read it in the signs. As much as I love to read the actual lines that we get, I love to read in between the lines, and I think it's harder to do that when it's a dual point of view. All of that being said, I devoured this book, and it's like 600 pages almost, and I read it in 2 days. I just find her writing so bingeable. I loved getting back into her writing. It made me realize that I missed reading her books, and I'm really excited for the second one in this Inheritance series that is to come, which is going to be set in London, and it's kind of loosely based on Jack the Ripper, so that's going to be really cool as well. So that was La Révolte de la Reine by Morgane Moncomble. After that, I read arguably the most popular book of this year, although I say arguably, but I do think it's the most popular book of this year, and that is Yesteryear by Cara Claire Burke. Here we follow Natalie, who is a trad wife influencer. She lives on a farm with her husband and their countless children, and she makes content for the internet about her perfect, or seemingly perfect, trad wife life, and she kind of portrays an old lifestyle that she doesn't even live with because she reaps all the benefits of the 21st century. And then we are suddenly thrown back in the 1800s, in the 19th century, when Natalie has to actually live the life that she portrayed to the whole entirety of the internet. It's really hard to explain this plot because I think partly the plot is misleading, and partly you can't really explain plot better without spoiling the book. Those of you who have read it will understand what I mean by that. But I think I went into this book expecting this woman to realize that the life that she was leading is actually not that good, and that she, would start really realizing that what she is advertising to her followers is not good, and that living through it actually would make her realize that. But I don't think that's really the case with Natalie, and the book ended up taking a turn that I did not see coming, that I ended up really liking on reflection. And some of the things that happen in this book are genuinely crazy, but I know that they could happen. That's what was so crazy. But because I was expecting something very specific, the book was a bit disappointing because it wasn't what I expected, and obviously that's my fault for going in with wrong expectations. But I think it's because I heard so much about it that I imagined it was going to be something that it wasn't, and I still really enjoyed it. I thought it was really cool. I thought it was a very strong debut. It was very ironic, and the subjects that it does end up exploring are very important. I also said this on my Goodreads review, but I feel like this book would have hit harder personally if I hadn't read Educated by Tara Westover a few months ago, because I can't really explain, but it did remind me of Educated. But yeah, I would still highly recommend. I genuinely can't wait for my roommates to read it. So if they're watching this, I hope that they're going to read it soon, because I just want to talk about it, because some of the things that happen in here, I'm so excited to hear their reactions, because it's crazy. And I think this is why this book is so popular, is because it's such a good book club pick. there's so much to talk about. There's so much to debate. The plot twist is incredible, and you probably won't see it coming. And I honestly love that the plot twist was what it was. It was just really, really strong. Just not a favorite like I thought it would be, but still very strong. So that was Yesteryear by Cara Claire Burke. And after that, I was still in a mood for romance. So I read my third and final romance of the month, and that was Un été pour te retrouver, again by Morgane Moncomble. This one follows Jasmine, who broke up with her ex 3 years back, and she is going to the wedding of their best friends that they have in common, and so she knows that she's going to see him there. She tries to make him jealous, or at least tries to make it seem like she's really over him by pretending to date the first guy that she sees at this wedding. And then we follow her and her ex and that guy as well as they go on the best friend's honeymoon, because they decided to have a buddy moon, which is basically just going on a road trip all around Italy for 2 months all together, and that's the honeymoon. And so she is going to reconcile what went on with her ex. And yeah, okay, this one is very difficult to speak about because the advertisement for this book is misleading, and I know that that's the point, but because I was expecting something very specific going into it, I was disappointed that it didn't end up being what I was expected. But then as I was reading, what I wanted to happen happened, but I thought one of the resolutions of this book was too easy, and I wish that it didn't end up being that. But I still really liked this book. When I was talking about Emma Brody doing something different with the romance genre, I could say the exact same thing about this book, but I think that it's even more different than any romance book that I have ever read. The way that she went about it was really, really strong. It explored subjects that aren't talked about enough, especially in the romance genre in general, but especially in the romance genre. And I really appreciated the way that she went about exploring these subjects. And so I'm really torn with this book between half of it expecting something that didn't actually happen because I was made to believe that that was going to happen, and then really loving what she did with it. And I understand why it was advertised in the way that it was, but I do think that it would have worked a bit better if they had been a tiny bit more unclear about the plot when advertising this book. In the end, I still really enjoyed it, and I enjoy it more the more I think about it because I really liked what she did with it. But I think I would have enjoyed it more if it had a little bit more of a literary fiction style in a way that I can't really explain without spoiling, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but really enjoyed it, could have enjoyed it a tiny bit more. After that, I read Transit by Rachel Cusk, which this is the book that comes after Outline. In this one, we follow the same main character as in Outline, and this is after she moves back to London after her divorce. The Outline trilogy follows this main character as she has conversations with people, and I don't know why the first 2 books, at least to me, were so strong. I think Rachel Cusk leaves so much unsaid, and yet the conversations that she decides to write on paper are just so mind-blowing, and they're so just basic at the same time. But I think how she chose to transcribe these conversations just reveals a lot about the main character, but reveals a lot about the human experience and thought processes. It's very philosophical, and I really, really, really love this one. I can't wait to read Kudos. I honestly didn't expect myself to like Outline as much as I did, and so when I had this on my shelf, I was like, you know what, I want to read it now. And I really loved it. I just love the way she writes, and I love the explorations in this trilogy and how she goes about them in the structure or the style. I think that's really cool. So that's Transit by Rachel Cusk. The next book that I finished was Loved One by Aisha Muharrar. This follows Julia after the passing of her first love, and she's having a very hard time reconciling their friendship and relationship after this passing. After he passes, his mom asks her to collect all of his belongings, and that leads her to his ex-girlfriend, and things start to unfold from there. I finished this book yesterday and I really, really enjoyed it. I loved the way it was written, and I loved the story. This talks about the initial stage of grief, and the thing that plagues the main character felt like something that could plague me if it happened to me personally. I really enjoyed the way the book explored multiple timelines, namely her meeting Gabe and her falling in love with Gabe as a teenager and then seeing him again and them becoming best friends. And I also really loved the relationship between her and Gabe's ex, Elizabeth. In that sense, it kind of almost reminded me of The Wedding People by Alison Espach, and also in the way that it was written, because it's about a very difficult topic and it's about something that is definitely definitely serious, but it takes a more lighthearted and humoristic approach, not to make that very important thing and the grief seem satirical, but more in a, dark humor kind of way, which is definitely how a lot of people process, including me. So I really appreciated it for that matter. I do wish that we'd gone a tiny bit more into the emotions of Julia, but I understand why we didn't, because she herself is having a hard time understanding her emotions at this moment. I thought I explored grief in a very good way, and I really liked how it was written. I really liked the characters in this book, and I think that's the strongest part of this book. I'll be really curious to read what Aisha Muharrar comes out with next, because also she's really funny. Although I will say at times this was very millennial humor, but that's not something that I can hold against our author, as she herself is a millennial. So that was Loved One by Aisha Muharrar. And then finally, the book that I read all throughout the month was Wednesday's Child by Yoon Lee. This is a short story collection that explores different themes, but I will say the reoccurring themes were divorce or strains in long-term relationships with a spouse, the passing of your child. Having read Yoon Lee's memoir, Things in Nature Merely Grow, gives a lot of context to this short story collection, but it also kind of takes away from some of the stories, because you can tell that she was really trying to process what she was going through. Not that it takes away, but it was more themes that I'd already read about by the same author in a book where she's talking about herself. So when I was reading those stories, I was partly like, okay, this is really strong because I know exactly what she's talking about and what she's referring to. But then again, I read this already in a way where she was a lot more straightforward because she was talking about her own experiences. But some of the stories in here are really, really strong. I'm not a big short story collection fan, and I don't think I'll read many more going forward, because even though I really love Yoon Lee and I love the way she writes, I like to linger with characters. I like to follow them across a lot of pages, and obviously you can't do that with a short story collection. Another theme is the Chinese American identity, which she didn't talk too much about in her memoir, so I thought that that was very well explored in this short story collection. But as is the case with any short story collections, there are stronger stories and weaker stories, but I will say most of the stories I ended up really liking, and this comforted me in reading The Book of Goose, which I've been pushing off because I have a feeling that I'm going to love this book and I'm scared of reading it at the wrong time, or even worse, not liking it to the extent that I believe that I'm going to like it in my head, which is something that I do often with 5-star predictions. But nonetheless, I think if you haven't read Yoon Lee and you're interested in exploring her writing and her voice, I think this is a good entry point. But I will say her memoir was stronger personally. So that was Wednesday's Child by Yoon Lee. And those were all of the 10 books that I read last month. I'm hoping that July is as good of a reading month for me, because I'm finally back in the reading mood. I've finally been reading more and at a more consistent pace, got out of my horrible May reading slump. So it's really nice to feel this way. I have, as you saw, a big pile of books that I would like to read in the summer months, and so I'm excited to be reading over the summer. Let me know what your favorite book from June was. My personal top 3, if you're curious, were of course Into the Blue, Transit, and Loved One, I would say. I just want to also say thank you so much for the 5,000 of you who subscribed. When I saw that number, that really meant a lot. And I also want to say thank you to all of the people who watched my last video and gave it a lot of love, because I know that a lot of my new subscribers came from there. So thank you so much for watching this one, and I'll see you next week for a new video. Bye!